And an Australian woman accused of murdering 3 members of her ex-husband's family by serving them poisonous mushrooms is now taking the stand in her own defense. Prosecutors claim Erin Patterson served beef Wellington made with death cap mushrooms. She denies the charges and told the jury earlier the poisoning was a tragic accident. Foreign correspondent Britt Clennett is following the latest on that case for her. Britt, what is she saying in her defense? How is this case going?
Hi, Diane. Well, as she took the stand for a second day, Erin Patterson told the jury that she picked and ate wild mushrooms several years before that deadly lunch, saying she developed this hobby for foraging during COVID, saying they just taste more interesting, more flavor. Now, she told the court that she bought most of those ingredients for that lunch at a local supermarket, and some were purchased from an Asian grocer in Melbourne, others from a supermarket. She said sometimes in that grocer, the bags might say something like wild mushroom mix. Now, she said she couldn't remember the specific purchase. There was also a dehydrator that she bought, which she said she did so to keep the mushrooms fresher for longer.
So, Britt, what is the prosecution presenting so far to try to prove that this was intentional, this was no accident?
Yeah, so today when she was asked if she agreed the beef Wellington that she served to her relatives that day must have contained death cap mushrooms, Patterson gave the very brief and very direct answer, yes, I do, therefore admitting that those poisonous mushrooms were actually in there for the first time. Now, at the center of this is intention, whether she intended to kill her lunch guests, and they need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that's the case. And prosecutors have very much honed in on her internet history, a search for websites that locate wild mushrooms for kind of nature enthusiasts. There's also an emphasis on messages that she sent her family members, her ex-husband's relatives. According to local journalists inside the court, there were moments that brought her to tears, including when her messages in a Facebook friendship group were read aloud in court, with one saying, "This family, I swear to God," with an expletive in there too. Patterson said she felt ashamed by those messages.
All right, Britt Clennett, thank you.
Now to a trial focusing on whether a woman committed murder by serving mushrooms with lunch.
It's a case straight out of a true crime TV drama.
Panicked lies, fake cancer claims, different coloured plates, and an admission that wild mushrooms were foraged and used in a deadly dish.
50-year-old Erin Patterson, a mother from a small town in southeastern Australia, is accused of killing 3 of her former in-laws with a home-cooked meal laced with poisonous death cap mushrooms. In July 2023, the parents of Patterson's ex-husband, Don and Gail Patterson, and Gail's sister died after eating a beef Wellington at Erin's home. She insists the poisoning was accidental.
With some of the best people I've ever met, they never did anything wrong to me, and I'm so devastated about what's happened.
In court yesterday, online acquaintances described Patterson as being obsessed with mushrooms, allegedly writing on Facebook, "I've been hiding powdered mushrooms in everything, mixed it into chocolate brownies yesterday. The kids had no idea." Prosecutors claim Patterson faked a cancer diagnosis to lure the victims to her home for the lunch and say she served her own portion of the meal on a different colored plate. They say at first she claimed she had bought the mushrooms, but later admitted foraging for them. Her past also under scrutiny. She was charged with attempting to murder her ex-husband multiple times in previous years, but those charges were dropped.
She's pleaded not guilty to all charges. The trial could last 6 weeks.
And an Australian woman is facing life in prison for the so-called mushroom murders. A court found Erin Patterson guilty of murdering 3 family members and attempting to kill a 4th by serving beef Wellington laced with toxic mushrooms. Her lawyers argued it was just a terrible accident, but the jury disagreed. ABC News foreign correspondent Britt Clennett has the details. Britt, what's the latest?
Britt, what's the latest? Go.
Well, Erin Patterson has been found guilty of murder, as you say, in this extraordinary trial that has made global headlines. And to quickly recap, Diane, 5 people sat down to eat lunch, imagine this, at her home in rural Australia in July 2023. And within a week, 3 would be found dead, a 4th would be fighting for his life, and the 5th standing trial for intentionally poisoning her guests with toxic mushrooms served in a beef Wellington. Now, after this very high-profile trial in a very small town in rural Australia, as I say, Patterson has now been found guilty of murdering 3 relatives at the lunch and attempting to kill another. Now, Patterson had pleaded not guilty to all her charges, with her lawyers arguing that this was a terrible accident. And on Monday, the jury of 12 found Patterson guilty, as I say, on all 4 charges after a week of deliberating. Now, the mother of 2 is now facing life in prison. Her sentencing will come at a later date that we just don't know about yet because it hasn't been set, but it will be perhaps in the following weeks. She'll be remanded until then, and she can still appeal the guilty verdict. Now, there have been plenty of twists and turns during this trial, keeping public interest running very high, and with everyone in Australia and beyond talking about it. The prosecution telling the court that Patterson had employed major deceptions in order to murder her guests, including fabricating a cancer diagnosis to lure them to the lunch. All 4 of her guests at that lunch were hospitalised with severe stomach issues after they'd eaten. That's according to prosecutors. And Patterson's in-laws, Don and Gail, they died along with Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson. Ian was the sole survivor. He was Heather's husband, and he spent weeks in hospital and eventually testified. But Patterson's husband, interestingly enough, turned down the lunch invitation. Patterson then lied that she was also sick from the food to avoid suspicion. That's according to prosecution. But as I say, it's now up to Patterson's lawyers to see if she will appeal this. Diane.
Britt Clinton, thank you.
It's a criminal case that is captivating Australia. The so-called mushroom murder trial. A suburban Australian mom accused of killing 3 of her husband's relatives by poisoning them with death cap mushrooms served in a home-cooked beef Wellington. Erin Patterson has pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. ABC News' foreign correspondent Britt Clinton is tracking this story from Hong Kong. And Britt, give us some context here. What do prosecutors say her motive was in all of this?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, Erin Patterson is a 50-year-old mother of 2. She stands accused of murdering the parents and aunt of her ex-husband, Simon. Now, he actually backed out of this ill-fated lunch. Prosecutors say Patterson, who was separated from but on good terms with her husband, she invited his parents, aunt and uncle over for lunch to discuss medical issues that she says she was facing. Now, all 4 of Patterson's lunch guests were hospitalized with severe stomach issues the day after the meal. 3 of them died the following week, all from altered liver function, multiple organ failure due to mushroom poisoning. Now, Erin Patterson, she has always maintained her innocence. Her lawyers say the death cap mushroom poisoning, it's tragic and it was a terrible accident. But this trial, Alex, now in its 4th week, is happening in this very small regional town just outside of Melbourne. And local reporters say that most of the time she has worn a calm, neutral expression that gives very little away, even when the judge makes a joke to cut the tension in the courtroom. Other than not guilty, Miss Patterson, she hasn't said a word yet in the trial, nor has she needed to, really. You know, the burden of proof very much rests squarely with the prosecution, as always, and that bar, it is extremely high when it comes to convincing a jury that someone is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, in this case, of poisoning her relatives with a toxic beef Wellington.
Well, and Britt, there was a big focus on her computer. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so a look at the search history on her computer in her house showed that it had been actually used to visit websites that listed sightings of death cap mushrooms by kind of, people who are nature enthusiasts, you might say. The court also, we heard from the investigator who is the final prosecution witness. He said that phone records indicate that a SIM card was switched while police were searching her phone, her home rather. Also, that the phone that she primarily used in the months leading up to this lunch it was never actually found by police. She also sent multiple text messages to her mother-in-law about health issues and medical appointments that police found no record of her ever actually having. On another day, digital forensic analyst, he said that pictures of yellowy dried mushrooms in a food dehydrator were found on a Samsung tablet. Previously, her estranged husband, Simon, he spoke of this witty, very intelligent woman he fell in love with. He also described his ex-wife as someone who could be argumentative and capable of inflammatory behavior. But the sole lunch guest who survived this lunch was Pastor Ian Wilkinson. He's Simon's estranged husband's the estranged husband's uncle. Now, Mr. Wilkinson said that his wife Heather gratefully accepted an invite to Miss Patterson's place for lunch. He said, despite not quite understanding the reason for it. So lots of twists and turns in this, but this is the last prosecution witness, as I say, Alex. So we are getting closer to the end.
So many questions. Britt, thank you so much for that update.